So last time we had talked about synchronization and we got into a little bit of confusion. I must admit that it's a very confusing topic, and I talked with a few other people about it, and I think everybody found it rather difficult to say what synchronization should mean in general relativity. And the conclusion that I could reach was the following. Synchronization, what it should mean is that at two different points, two people having clocks should have a way of agreeing that their clocks are telling the same time, which means the time can be compared. So it means the possibility to compare time at one point and another time. Now you could do that in many different ways, but any way that you think of should pass some tests for it to be valid. And as I showed last time, in fact, the most reasonable test you would expect is not satisfied by any definition. Well, I showed you one definition, but you can convince yourself that there isn't any definition which would satisfy the following reasonable criterion: that if you synchronize clocks along a loop, along a line, and then that line closes and comes back to its starting point, then the clock should come back to its starting point. We saw that the barrier for that, again, barrier preventing that to happen, or the obstruction for that, is the presence of a component G0I in the metric. Okay. However, we also saw that by a clever choice of coordinates, you can eliminate G0I. So my conclusion is that it's only possible to synchronize clocks if you are working in synchronous coordinates. That is why these coordinates, I suppose, were invented. So we remember that synchronous coordinates are those where G0I is 0 and G00 is 1, and these are four conditions, so they can be satisfied at each point by a coordinate choice. Okay. This introduces possibly very complicated time dependence into Gij components, but the metric has the form ds squared equals minus dt squared plus Gij x and t dxi dxj. The price you pay is this t dependence. On the other hand, it's a nice thing that now space-time doesn't look like time and space are mixed up. Time is time, and moreover it has coefficient 1. So in these coordinates, one can define clocks at each point which, whenever compared, will agree. That means whatever experiment you do, whether by sending a light signal or by bringing them to each other, they'll agree. But without these coordinates, if you had G0I, then this would not be possible. And the advantage of having G00 equals 1 gives you a new property of synchronization which is important. Supposing I have 2 points, x and y, this is spatial x. And supposing at this time and this time, at this point and this point, I have some clocks that I claim to be synchronized, and I start them ticking at the same time. Then I let some time elapse, which I measure here in my coordinate system here and there in my coordinate system there, and then I stop them ticking. Okay? So, what I should find is that the amount of proper time elapsed here and here are equal. Then two people, when they talk, can agree that their clocks were running at the same rate. But that won't be true if G00 is not 1, because if G00 is not 1, then coordinate time and proper time for such things are not equal. Okay? Is that clear? Because the relation is that d tau would be G00 dx, probably root or minus, at each of the points where this is proper time and this is coordinate time. So if G00 varies as you go from this point to this point, then the proper time elapsed here and here will not be the same for equal amounts of coordinate time. So that's another negative, in the sense that we can't agree on very much if we have two observers at these 2 points. So therefore, the special thing of G00 being 1 makes proper time intervals coincide, and G0I equals 0 makes it possible to synchronize on a loop. So I think my conclusion is that if these conditions are not met, then you cannot synchronize, you cannot give a meaning to synchronized clocks at different places in space-time. But happily, since these conditions are not conditions on a metric, but they are conditions on the coordinate system, therefore they can always be met. Okay. Now today, what I want to discuss is the issue of, two issues which will prepare us so that from basically next time we can then start looking at solutions to Einstein's equations in various contexts. Now the first issue that I want to look at today is about conservation laws. And here again, if you remember, since the last lecture, we've been trying to understand what changes in our understanding of physics by going to general relativity, where space and time coordinates can be changed at will. So here's a simple paradox. What's a conservation law? It is the fact that something is the same today, tomorrow, after some lapse of time, something is independent of time. Very good. Now time is not properly defined not uniquely defined in general relativity, because I can make a coordinate transformation and go to a new time. Okay. So then, what on earth does a conservation law mean? Okay. How can it be a meaningful concept when time itself is not a meaningful concept? Conservation implies independence of time. Let's write it as time independence. What happens after a change of coordinates? A related point is that there are many quantities that we think of as conserved in nature, like energy and momentum. Now, energy and momentum in general relativity have to be combined into a 4-vector, also in special relativity. In special relativity, there is no big difference between the 4-vector with components up or down. At most, there is a plus or minus sign. So, if it's conserved with its components up, then it's also conserved with its components down. But in general relativity, it's not the same, because there is a g mu nu in between, and g mu nu may depend on time. Okay. So, how do we know what quantity is conserved? It's a related question. Now, this is just an example. P mu or P mu, which is G mu nu, P mu. This is just one example of a puzzle, right? So we are going to have these puzzles and we need to address them. So let me start by addressing the second one, which turns out to be quite easy, and then we'll come to the first one. So to address the second one, let's recall our favorite exercise, which was the study of a point particle propagating in a curved space. Okay, this is a problem we have returned to many times to get intuition, and we'll return to it again to ask ourselves the question: how is conservation related to what does conservation mean in a curved space? Once we understand that, we'll be able to guess quite easily what it means in curved space-time. Okay. Now you remember, so first of all, Gij is a function of all three coordinates x. Let's assume there are three coordinates. Okay. Now you remember from discussions of particle mechanics. Yes, Anil?
I didn't understand your point about the G mu thing.
Yes.
You're always working in metrics which are connection, Kilmer connection. So whenever you take a d mu, you will always pull out and you will get a 0.
Yes.
So So
But okay.
Why should it matter? I cannot understand it.
Okay. So good. I'm glad you brought it up because in your mind, conserved means d by dt equals of something is 0, right? That's what you mean? But that's not what I. Conserved means that it doesn't change in time. Okay? It may be that time translations are generated by ordinary d by dt, not capital D by dt. Okay? Now, sometimes we use both expressions interchangeably. Okay, so let me do the following. Let me incorporate your question as a third question, which may not be independent of these, but it's another way to ask the question. Does conserved mean d by dt of something is 0, where we understand that this would be ordinary d by dt plus some connection term, or this? Okay. In fact, conserved cannot mean this. Okay. This we call covariantly conserved, but it doesn't have the physical meaning of conserved, which is independent of time, because such a thing is not independent of time. Right? A quantity satisfying this will change in time because the small d by dt of it will be equal to some other term. Okay. Now, it's very nice to say that on general grounds there cannot be a conservation law like this because this is not a covariant concept and this is a covariant concept, true. But we do experiments, and when we do experiments we measure something, and that thing, if we find that it's not the same today and tomorrow, then we simply say that it's not conserved. Okay? And it's not clear at all that what we measure is the rate of change with respect to this thing. I'll come back to that point, but you'll see it most strongly in the course when we study cosmology, because we've talked about the energy momentum tensor being conserved, and that conservation is capital D mu T mu equals 0. We'll see that exactly tells us that the energy momentum tensor is not ordinary divergence free, and energy and momentum are not conserved in a universe which is time dependent. Why is that? Exactly because of the difference between this and this. Okay? But it's good you brought it up. So now let's examine this question, and let's do it first with this favorite Lagrangian of mine. Now, from more conventional Lagrangians for a particle, which are of the form half mx dot squared minus v of x, you must have seen some rule which says that if the potential is independent of some coordinate, that coordinate is called cyclic, and the momentum corresponding to that is conserved. But that's true here also, except it's not the potential, it's this guy which could be dependent or independent of some coordinate. So, for example, if Gij, let me now name the coordinates as x, y, z, is independent of z, then Pz, which is d Lagrangian by d z dot, z is just x. This has to be conserved. This is the statement that that coordinate is cyclic. So this is conserved. So d p z by dt is 0. Now what is Pz as per this Lagrangian? So Pz is g z I x dot. If this notation confuses you, maybe it's better to call it P3. So it's x1, x2, x3 is independent of x3. Okay, so this is P3 and this is conserved. So you see we've got some answer to the question. In this case, it's not x dot upper 3 which is conserved, but G3I x dot upper I, which is conserved. Okay, so you've got an answer in this case to a question which I wrote up there, whether it's P upper mu or G mu nu P upper. Is it clear? We've got an answer. I don't see anyone looking convinced. Yes.
When we discussed this action for a free particle,
Yes.
some time back, we preferred the one that describes the sign.
Yeah, this is the action for a free non-relativistic particle moving in a curved space. This is not the action for a free particle moving in a curved space-time. But in this example, we've got an answer. This, of course, precisely because of that, notice that there is no zero component in xi. Xi is only x1, x2, x3. Okay? So it's a different problem. But in that problem, you could have asked the same question. That okay, supposing the system, the particle is moving on a space which has a cylindrical symmetry, like an egg, let's say. So, no, not like an egg, sorry. It's a cylindrical symmetry, so it's something like some shape. You could take any figure and then translate it uniformly along the z direction from minus to plus infinity. Okay, that is a generalized cylinder. Now, in that space, we expect some z component quantity to be conserved, but the question is it x dot 3, x3 dot? And the answer is no, it's not in general x3 dot, but it's g3I xi dot, and it depends on what is the structure of this g. Okay, and this equation that d of p3 by dt is 0 will mean that x double dot I plus something made out of this is 0. So we've got some answer. Now I'm going to claim, but I won't actually show it here. Likewise, for a particle with the square root action that was just referred to in curved space-time, the when the metric is stationary, then d by d tau of g0 mu x dot nu is 0. This is the conservation. So metric being stationary, which means there is some coordinate system in which it's explicitly time independent. Okay. Then this quantity differentiated in proper time is 0. It's the analog of that, but this doesn't follow from that action. This follows from the square root action, which I wrote down some time ago. Okay. But it again tells you that the quantity which is conserved is g with lower indices, bringing down this thing, and not say just up x upper 0 dot. You can also think of this as saying that d by d tau of g0 nu p nu is 0, because p nu is what? This is x dot, this we call u nu, it's the for velocity, the thing which squares to minus 1, multiplied by the rest mass, and you get p nu. Okay, so this is the same conservation equation, and it's very simple. Now, you would think that this is a completely trivial and harmless statement, but what I'm going to show you, so please remember this one. I have to show you two things. One is, okay, this is fine, but this is true only in a coordinate system in which the metric is explicitly time independent, because when I say it's stationary, it means I've gone to a coordinate system where it's time independent, and it's that the time in that coordinate system is 0. Otherwise, you could always ask me, how do I know which coordinate to choose as 0? When I say g0 nu, that depends on which coordinate system I'm in, right? 0 of one coordinate system and x0 of another coordinate system are not the same. The answer in this case is that given that the metric is stationary, I go to that coordinate system in which it's explicitly time independent. And then I might still have some more freedom of coordinate transformations, but within that, this will always be true. Okay. So one question I have to answer for you is, what's the more general statement of this? The more general statement of conservation laws will require something called killing vectors, which we'll come back to in a few minutes. So let me write that here. The nice thing about killing vectors is that we won't need anymore to be in any particular coordinate system. Okay? The killing vector will embody the fact, for example, that the metric is stationary. It's stationary means in one coordinate system it's time independent. In any other coordinate system, it still has to be independent of something, right? There's some property of that metric which is allowing it to be time independent in one coordinate system. Whatever that property is carried over to arbitrary coordinate system will be embodied in something in this killing vector, and thereafter we will be able to make statements about conservation laws which are independent of any coordinate system. But before I do that, I want to make a slight digression and show you that this very harmless equation is at the root of the gravitational redshift. If you look at it, it's a very physical and measurable phenomenon if you look at it in a certain way. So gravitational redshift, of course, is just the fact that if I'm in a gravitational potential, then at different points in that potential, because of the difference in the amount of the potential, if it's not homogeneous, then my signals, light signals and so on, will have their frequency redshift. It will be red. Okay, so let's see. Of course, as you know, I have a lot of problem with signs, plus and minus, so whether it's redshift or blue shift, we'll see. But physically we know which situation causes redshift and which one causes blue shift. Basically, if one observer is accelerating away from the other, then we get a redshift. The wavelength gets stretched, it becomes longer, so the frequency goes down. So let's, now I'm assuming, well, I assume that you do know this phenomenon from Newtonian gravity, but if you don't, let's just go through it once. So let me first give you the derivation from in Newtonian theory, and then let's repeat it with our more modern understanding that it's and show that it's a conflict between observed energy and conserved energy. Basically the fact that these two are not the same, which causes the redshift. Okay. So what's the system we want to consider? So two objects accelerating away from each other. In this, okay, sorry, you're not accelerating away. Sorry, that's not what I wanted to say at all. Accelerating in the same, yeah, they are accelerating away from each other, but they are also accelerating independently in the same direction. So here is A, here is B. So A emits some light, but B is accelerating away from A. So what happens is that in the time it takes the light to get from here to here, the distance between A and B has stretched, and this wave has stretched, and that's the redshift. Shifted by the time it reaches B. This is an ordinary redshift. Now let's use the principle of equivalence to convert this into a possible experiment, not involving any actual accelerating objects, but just the acceleration due to gravity. And for this part of the discussion, we don't need to know even general relativity, but just a simple version of the principle of equivalence, which says that we can replace the accelerating observers, replace accelerations by gravitational field. And so what it means is that if I emit, instead of having these things accelerating, I have one of them here and one of them some distance away from the Earth, and I should have said these are accelerating the same amount in the same direction. So there's a constant acceleration, okay, and there's a redshift. Okay, so the amount of redshift can be easily calculated, and we'll just do it. But I can also replace this by a gravitational field with a constant acceleration due to gravity, and two objects which are, let's say, not too far away from the Earth, so they have the same acceleration due to gravity, but they are different heights. So the value of the Newtonian gravitational potential is different. Here it's gm upon r, and here it's gm upon r plus this distance. Okay, good. So now what I claim is that if I send the beam of light up from here, then by the time it reaches here, it will be redshifted. And it will be redshifted by exactly the same amount as the amount of redshift in this experiment if the accelerations here are matched with the gravitational accelerations here. So let's do that simple calculation. Okay. So, good. So let the time taken for the photon to reach from A to B call it delta t. Okay. Now, in this time, okay. Okay. Good. Let the frequency. I don't know if I want to. Let the frequency of the emitted photon be omega, actually be omega naught, now in time delta t, the separation between A and B has increased. Sorry, it's not the separation, it's the velocity. Wait, I think I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. Yeah. Yes, okay. Has increased by delta z. Okay. Therefore, delta t is equal to delta z by the speed of light. This much is certainly true. In that picture, I am calling z the horizontal direction, and in this second picture, it will be the vertical direction. Okay, very good. So, B now has a velocity, an extra velocity, moving faster than A after this time. Of delta V, which is equal to the acceleration times delta t, which by this formula is the acceleration times delta z on c. Good. Therefore, the photon is redshifted. This is all the data we need to know how much is redshifted, and we want it fractional redshift. So the change in the frequency divided by the original frequency of the photon. So this is going to be minus delta V by C. Okay, is this formula acceptable? So this says that the velocity, the change in velocity or the relative velocity of B to A in units of the speed of light is the fractional redshift. If I've got the sign right, then this will tell me that for positive delta V, the frequency will decrease, which is good. Okay. And this thing is equal to minus A delta Z by C squared. Good. So that's all you can say in that situation. But if you translate the situation into a gravitational experiment, then you can recast all these numbers in terms of the Newtonian potential. In this system, of course, A and B are completely at rest, and I'm simply setting up a beam of light from A to B and asking what happens to its frequency when it reaches B. Okay. Now, in this system, the acceleration is equal to del by del Z of the Newtonian potential. That's the acceleration due to gravity. So therefore, delta omega over omega naught is equal to minus 1 by C squared dz del Z of phi. Just taking over that last formula. And therefore the integrated change, this thing is the fractional change, if you like, of a fractional redshift. I don't know what name to give it. Let's call it delta R for redshift, this ratio. So the actual redshift is the integral of delta R from A to B. So that's equal to this, and then phi B minus phi A, or in other words, phi A minus phi B over C squared. So this is the famous formula for the gravitational redshift of a signal going from A to B. So this I assume you've all seen before, but anyway we derived it here again. Again, let's just keep checking that I've got the signs right. So the Newtonian potential is negative, but it's more negative at A and less negative at B. So therefore phi A minus phi B is negative, and therefore the change of frequency is negative. So still doing okay, I think. So it is a redshift. Okay? Okay. So that's the formula. And there's nothing much to say about it. This is just a standard derivation in Newtonian gravity. And now I want to show you this derivation of the same formula, same effect, same final formula, that redshift is difference of gravitational potentials. But starting from the point of view of general relativity and asking what is the observed energy of a beam, in this case the light beam, and what is the conserved energy of the beam. The conserved energy by definition will remain the same. The observed energy need not remain the same, and it's that change relative to the conserved energy which we'll see as a redshift. So let's do that calculation. So that involves starting from the beginning. So now derivation in GR. So the derivation in GR should return a formula, and that formula should be quite general, defined only in terms of GR quantities. But if those quantities happen to be very close to the Newtonian approximation, then we should get back the formula I just wrote. So let's do it. So in this case, what we do is we assume a metric which is static. Okay, that's the one in which this formula applies in general. So ds squared is g naught naught dt squared plus g ij dxi dxj, and both gij and g naught naught are allowed to be arbitrary functions of x but not functions of t. The static metric is one in which in some coordinate system all the components are independent of t, and also the cross term g0i is vanishing. So we've taken that to be the case. Okay. Now, consider an observer at rest. So, for an observer at rest, the velocity, the fall velocity, by definition of what it means to be an observer at rest, is that the fall velocity is u naught and then 0, 0, 0. Okay? Good. Now, in special relativity, if you remember, the fall velocity was gamma and then gamma times the 3 velocity, where gamma is 1 over square root of 1 minus v square by c square. So the generalization of that here is that it's an arbitrary Four vector such that u mu contracted with itself is minus 1. Okay, but that contraction is done with the metric. So u mu equals minus 1 really means g mu nu equals minus 1. But with this form of it, it means in this particular case and with that metric, it means g naught naught u naught square is minus 1. So it tells us that u naught has to be 1 over square root of minus g naught naught. So the first thing we learn is that a static observer, an observer at rest in a static metric, must have a Four velocity of this form where the 0 component is related to g0, 0, which is space dependent in general. Okay, so that's one thing. The next thing is, now let's try to measure, let's ask what it could mean to measure the frequency of a photon. Of course, that's the same as measuring the energy of the photon. Using an observer like this. Okay. So for that, we should of course remember that the photon, I don't know if I need this, I'll come back to that later. Okay. So for this, we must find some scalar quantity which can be made up out of the form momentum of the photon and extracted by an observer. Now naively in flat space, what should we do? Take the form momentum of the photon and pick out the 0 component. Okay, that we call the form momentum at 0 component is the energy. We are trying to do that, but a little bit more carefully and invariantly in GR. And here, the correct formula is that we should take the photon momentum p nu, the observer's Four velocity u mu, and contract them with the metric. So the claim is that this scalar quantity for an observer with a given Four velocity and a photon with a given momentum, so here is observers. Here I haven't assumed that the observer is at rest, but I will. Observers Four velocity, and this is photon or momentum. Okay, so this is a scalar you can form, and this is claimed to be E observed, and there might be a minus sign. That's up to us, but we should do it because in the standard, these kind of formulae can always be reduced by going to flat space time. G00 is minus 1, U0 is 1. So we would like to get P0, so to cancel the minus sign, this has a minus. That's not crucial, just makes the energy positive. Okay, good. Okay. Now, this is correct, and in a static metric and with an observer having this kind of, so with a static observer, this formula reduces to minus G naught naught U naught P naught. Okay. Static metric which I defined technically last time plus observer at rest. The second being that the U, the Four vector U, has only the 0 component. Okay. So this is one fact. However, now you see, if you remember what we did 15 minutes ago, in contrast, okay, and this we can also further write, U naught we know. I think we just found U naught is this. So therefore this is square root of minus G naught naught. Okay. In contrast, the conserved energy is, I'll call it E cons. So this is minus G 0 0 P0, which is the specialization of our previous formula, that is G 0 mu P mu. Okay, to the case that so I guess to the case where the metric is static, so it only has 0 0 not 0 I components. Okay, now you see the difference between E observed and E conserved. Okay, so we see from this formula, comparing it to this formula, oh sorry, actually this one, we see that there is a square root of G naught naught difference between the two. So we write this as E observed equals 1 over square root of minus G naught naught E conserved. Is this right? Now this one is going to be H bar times the observed frequency, and it's this frequency that will be redshifted or will be changed, even though E conserved doesn't change. That's what it means to be conserved. It will change only because G00 is different at the two ends of the experiment. So the experiment is done at a point A and a point B, which I had drawn earlier, and G00 is different at these 2 points. Okay, that's the reason why omega observed at one point is not equal to omega observed at the other point. And let's see if we get the same formula in the limit, but first let's just write this. Therefore, so this simply, we can simply write it as a ratio that omega at any point B over omega at a point A is the square root of G00 at the point A over G00 at the point B. So this is the formula for gravitational redshift. And here actually there shouldn't be any prejudice whether it's redshift or blue shift. It can be any shift depending on what G00 is doing. We've only assumed that we are in a static metric, but we don't know how G00 is varying with space. Okay. Now the test of whether this formula, which is derived from this nice beautiful relation between E observed and E conserved, whether this is the same formula as the formula I got before, follows in one line by saying that in the Newtonian approximation, and this we saw many lectures back, G00 is simply 1 plus 2 phi minus, right, and where phi is small. So good, so plug that in, and this one is the ratio of two frequencies, but the redshift is this minus 1. Okay, so it's omega B minus omega A, that's the shift, divided by the original frequency omega A. Okay, so if you do all that, it's very easy to see that you get delta, so omega B minus omega A upon omega A. This is what we defined as the redshift, and this comes up to be phi. So now I'm working with units where there is no, where C is 1, but I think otherwise C would have come into this formula. And now I won't swear that I've got the sign right, but anyway, that's the rest of it I'll leave to you. The main point here is that it's 1 plus 2 phi, but there's a square root. When I expand out 1 plus 2 phi square root, that's approximately 1 plus phi. So that's how I get exactly the right coefficient of this. Okay? So I hope with all of this, I've convinced you that it is useful to think carefully about what time means and what energy means and what a conserved quantity means, because this formula, of course, has enormously more applicability than the previous one, than that formula. That applies only in a weak gravitational field, but this is quite general. And this formula, as we'll see in certain situations, such as the Schwarzschild metric that we'll discuss from next time, will lead us to shocking results like zero or infinite redshifts and so on, because metrics can be weird in such a way that the G00 at some point might actually vanish or blow up. These kind of things can happen. Those situations are extremely far away from these situations where phi is close to 0, so this certainly doesn't apply. Okay. Now, having got through this example, I'd like to go back to the more general question that what does it mean to say something is time independent? So the formula that we used so this is the discussion of Killing vectors in general. So the way to address this is to ask the question that we saw E conserved equals minus G naught mu E nu in a particular class of coordinate systems But how do we understand this in general? So to understand it, we do a simple calculation, which is the following. Let's remind ourselves we call the geodesic equation for a particle looks like this. This is one way to write it. You could also write it by noticing that P is m times u mu, in which case it would be du by d tau plus gamma u equals 0. Just the same thing up to an overall factor of m. However, if we write it in that form, we realize that this term is symmetric in nu and lambda, which we'll use. Okay, now let's ask the question, what is dp nu by d tau? It's different from that exactly by lowering with g mu. Okay, so just ask for our own edification, what is this? And we'll see that unlike that, which leads to the geodesic equation, this one, as soon as we calculate it, leads to a conservation law. That's already a very beautiful fact. Of course, there's nothing new in the calculation. It's d by definition, it's d by d tau of g mu nu p nu. So there are two terms. One term is d p nu by d tau times g mu nu. And the other term is p nu times g mu nu comma lambda u lambda, where u lambda is dx lambda by d tau. Okay, this is equal to g mu nu times, so this equation is true, so I have to put minus the right hand side, so minus gamma mu lambda rho u lambda p rho plus p nu. So let's try to rewrite this nicely. U lambda p rho g mu lambda. And of course we recall that when you contract G mu nu with gamma, you lose the G upper which was there in gamma, and you get three terms which are all derivatives of G downstairs. Very simple, slightly tedious exercise. Just take you one more line. And the final answer of this is that it is a half U lambda P rho G lambda rho comma mu. So what happens is inside this there are three terms. The first two terms of gamma cancel with that together, and the last term survives and becomes this. Okay. Now you see, this is a illuminating way to see what we already know. It's just another way to say this thing, the mu component of this for a fixed mu, which is 0, 1, 2, 3 or 4, d by d tau of it vanishes whenever the metric is independent of that value of mu of x 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay? Whenever G lambda rho is independent of a particular direction x mu, this thing is conserved along the geodesic. So we see right away that this is a conservation law. This is actually the result I told you right in the beginning when I said that it's P mu lower rather than P mu upper, which is the conserved quantity. Here it is in a little bit more general. Okay? But we are not done yet. What's unsatisfactory about this formula? Okay, what's satisfactory is that it relates a very physical thing to a very physical thing in a fixed frame. What's unsatisfactory is that, of course, neither side is a vector. Though it has a lower index, after differentiating in d by d tau, this is not a vector. This involves first derivative of the metric, so this is not a vector either. Okay. So let's try to see if we can get a more invariant form for this equation. To get a more invariant form, what we really need is to introduce a fixed vector. So introduce a vector k mu and ask under what conditions k mu, which way is it? Sorry. K upper mu, and ask under what conditions k upper mu, p lower mu is conserved. This is a more invariant way of saying that when I pick a component mu, which could be 0, 1, 2 or 3, then if G is independent of that component, then this component is conserved. After all, imagine a metric in which G is not independent of x0, x1, x2 and x3, but it's independent of some linear combination of, say, x2 plus x3. Okay? Then in this basis, I might miss to find the conserved quantity, but there would be a conserved quantity. But it would occur by taking a suitable vector k mu, which just had a 1 and a 1 in the place of x2 and x3. It would project out that part which is conserved. That's why it's nice to introduce such a vector. But we are in GR, so I'm not going to assume this vector is constant. It could be constant, it may not be constant. Okay? We just introduce it and ask when the projection of this p lower mu on the direction of that vector is conserved. And we get a very illuminating answer. Calculation is trivial. We just write d by d tau k mu p mu. Okay. So we ask for this to be 0, and this involves two terms. One is d by d tau on k. So k is a vector field, so it will depend on space time. So d by d tau of k is k mu comma nu along the geodesic, and then p mu, plus the next term is k mu times d by d tau of p mu, which we already know to be all this. So half k mu u lambda p rho g lambda rho mu. Okay. Now you see this assembles itself if you think about it, up to now we've only been looking at this type of term, but now there's a term in which k can also vary. As I said, in GR, you can't have a notion of a constant vector. It will be constant in some frame, in some other frame it won't be constant. But this whole thing, of course, has to be a scalar, because what is it? It's d by d tau of a scalar. Okay, so this should assemble into some covariant quantity, and that quantity has to be linear in u lambda, linear in p rho, both terms are, and actually then it has, so good. So there's a little bit of manipulation you can see, because I'll take this p and write it as p upper with the g, and then combine that g with this derivative and all the other terms, and I find a very nice expression that at the end it's a half of this times d lambda k rho plus d rho. Okay. Basically what happens is, this is a vector with an upper index, this is its ordinary derivative, but raising the index of p gives me a metric, so that lowers this index and gives me some extra derivative terms of the metric, which when I combine them with this ends up being the Christoffel symbol. And the reason why this is symmetrized is because u lambda p rho is symmetric in lambda and rho. That's because u and p are proportional vectors. Okay. It's important to symmetrize. If you do the calculation, you may only get this part of it with a 1 coefficient. That's also correct. But you can't from that conclude that d lambda k rho must be 0, because it's multiplying a symmetric object. So only the symmetric part of it can be put to 0. The antisymmetric part isn't actually there in the equation. So we conclude that k mu p mu is conserved if and only if d lambda k rho plus d rho k lambda will 0. And this equation is called Killing's equation. And any 4 vector, or in general any vector which satisfies this, is called the Killing vector. Please notice that the Killing vector is defined with its index up, but Killing's equation is an equation for the corresponding vector with its index being low. Okay. Now what have we gained by doing this? Well, notice that this quantity is the ordinary derivative of k plus the ordinary derivative of k plus some connection terms. Okay. If k is constant, actually constant vector, then of course all the ordinary derivative terms drop out, and we find some condition on derivatives of the metric. What condition it is it? We've already seen it. In fact, it's here. If k is constant, then basically we get this kind of condition. What's nice is that in this equation there is no obligation for k to be constant. It can be anything. Okay, and the condition, Killing's equation, is a perfectly tensor equation. So if it's valid in one coordinate system, it's valid in all coordinate systems. So here's a concrete application. Imagine that in one coordinate system, the metric is time independent. Okay, in that case, the vector k upper mu being 1, 0, 0, 0 is a Killing vector. Okay, but now if we are in some other coordinate system, then of course 1, 0, 0, 0 isn't a Killing vector in the new coordinate system. But whatever vector we get by going from 1, 0, 0, 0 in the old system by the coordinate transformation to the new one will be a Killing vector. Okay, that means that there will be a vector which will tell me that the metric is secretly time independent in any coordinate system. But that vector, first of all, need not point in the direction of time. Secondly, need not even be constant. It has no obligation to be just d by dt. Okay, it doesn't generate time translation, it generates some very complicated translation on the coordinates. Of course, if it is secretly a time killing vector, then it will be time-like. That means this norm will be appropriate sign to be time-like, because that norm is preserved under coordinate changes. Okay. So we learn in particular time independence in one coordinate frame such as what we used to define a stationary metric translates immediately into existence of a time-like killing vector in any other coordinate frame which releases us from thinking about conservation laws as mere independence of some particular coordinate. Much more general than that. In general, every killing vector implies a conserved quantity. And what's the conserved quantity? K mu P mu. Now, to conclude this part of the discussion, there is one little thing that you must have already noticed. Where have you seen this kind of expression before?
Change in coordinate transformation.
Is the change of the metric under a coordinate transformation. How does that agree with the fact that this is the equation for a killing vector? How do you relate these two apparently different things? First of all, here we are not making any coordinate transformation. We just got a vector, and we are saying that if that vector satisfies this equation, it corresponds to a conservation law. There, on the other hand, we were making a coordinate transformation. But there is a natural way to identify these two by saying the coordinate transformation generated by a vector k nu, if that vector is a killing vector, is a coordinate transformation which doesn't have any effect on the metric. The form of the metric remains the same. Okay? Because this is delta G mu nu under a coordinate transformation generated by this. The form of the metric remains the same is the statement of a conservation law. So now let's give a very concrete example. Imagine the metric of an egg. Okay, it's a little fatter at the bottom, it's a little pointy towards the top, but it has a symmetry under, only one symmetry under rotations around the z-axis. Okay. Now supposing I fix this egg and I write the metric, whatever it is, I get something. Now I infinitesimally rotate the egg. Okay, along that axis. What's the new metric? Exactly the same as the old one. Okay, which means that under the, but I can think of this as a coordinate transformation because instead of rotating the egg, I can say that the coordinate of every point on the egg has been shifted to the coordinate at a neighboring point. And how is that neighboring point defined? By the action of the killing vector. Okay. So you see that I can think of it in two ways. I can think of it as a coordinate transformation or as a action on the, it's really a difference between active and passive points. So it's a coordinate transformation or it's a physical motion of the egg. If the physical motion leaves the egg invariant, then it's a conserved, then there's a conserved quantity. But the corresponding coordinate transformation then must leave the metric invariant. So that links the conserved quantity with the coordinate transformation. So let me write that statement. Killing vector And mathematicians have a name for a coordinate transformation that leaves the form of the metric invariant. They call it an isometry. Iso means same and metry is metric. So isometry is a transformation of the metric which at the end of it leaves the metric the same as it was before. Okay, so a killing vector and isometry are the same thing. Isometry is how a mathematician would see it, but the mathematician would not be thinking about conserved quantities, would be thinking about keeping the metric form invariant. We as physicists are interested in conserved quantities, though I should emphasize that conserved in its usual meaning means conserved in time. So actually all killing vectors don't lead to conserved quantities, only time-like killing vectors lead to conserved quantities. But even there could be null killing vectors, there could be space-like killing vectors, they teach us something about the system. In general, space-like killing vectors, for example, the example of the egg I just gave was a space-like killing vector. Okay. So that could teach us about some symmetry of the system, while the time-like ones tell us about something that the system does which is the same today and tomorrow. In time evolution it's the same. So that's what we call a conservation. So that's the notion of killing vector.
Sir,
and yes.
Sir, if we can write the metric
Yes.
in such a way that we can read from the metric that it's not dependent on any of the factors.
Yes.
So we can claim that in that direction any translation will be a killing vector.
That's correct, but the converse is not true. There could be a killing vector and you may never ever find a coordinate system in which that killing vector is manifested as independence of the metric from some coordinate. Or maybe you can. I'm not 100% sure in all circumstances. Yeah. So let's say you have a bunch of, let's say you have many killing vectors. You might at best be able to find a coordinate system in which the metric is, one of the killing vectors is manifest as coordinate independence of the metric, but not all. Simultaneously, all you cannot do. In fact, the killing vectors may not commute as vector fields. Let me give you a concrete example. Consider the two-dimensional sphere. How many killing vectors can you think of for it? 3. That's remarkable already. 3 two-component vectors. 3 different two-component vectors are killing vectors of the sphere. Okay? 3 because rotation about x-axis, y-axis, z-axis are all symmetries, any combination of those also. But the sphere is only two-dimensional. So now you're puzzled, how can there be 3 different linearly independent two-component vectors? Of course they can't be, but remember they are not constant vectors. Okay? They would be constant vectors if the sphere metric was independent of that coordinate. But you can't make the sphere metric independent of x, y and z all at the same time, right? There wouldn't be any metric left. But you can make it independent of, let's say, theta or phi or something in some particular coordinate system where you can see that, in fact it is right, the usual one. Let's just see this, forget about sphere. Just think of the plane d theta squared plus, so what is it? Sine squared theta. Actually, this is the metric of the two sphere, right? So let's think about this as the metric of the two sphere. D theta squared plus sine squared theta, d phi squared. Good. So what's the which coordinate? Which coordinate is the metric independent of between theta and phi? It's independent of phi. So phi is a killing vector. Now there must be a killing vector for the theta direction, but it's not manifest in this metric, which means the killing vector for the theta direction cannot be just the constant vector. Must be some must have some dependence. You see that? The killing vector which is visible to you when you look at a metric and say, it doesn't depend on phi, so d by d phi is the killing vector. So in theta phi space the vector is 0, 1. Okay? But there has to be a metric, there has to be a vector for theta transformations also, because we know that a shift in theta is also a symmetry of the sphere, and we know that there is a third one which is neither shift in only theta or only phi. There are 3 killing vectors. So the other 2 are not visible, which means that the other 2 are not constant vectors in these coordinates. Okay? So that's how it happens, that you can have more than 2 killing vectors in a 2-dimensional space. You can have as many as 3.
And
however, you can't have more than 3. I'll give you a formula.
Is it guaranteed that you are setting an upper level of the number of killing vectors.
Yes.
How many killing vectors will be? In general, can we say that any plane will have 3 killing vectors?
Plane. What do you mean by plane?
A surface, any surface.
No. In general, a surface will have no killing vectors. Why should a surface have any symmetry at all? Killing vector is giving us a symmetry, right? Now see, again you must distinguish between time-like killing vector and killing vector. Killing vector in an ordinary spatial geometry may not be there. Just take the sphere and poke it randomly in various places to make bumps and dents. There will be absolutely no killing vector left, and that's it. It has no symmetry. Anytime you turn it in any way, it maps to it becomes a different metric. So it has no killing vector, so it doesn't have to have. However, as far as time-like killing vector, there's a different thing, which is that we are doing physics, and physics involves quantities that are conserved in time. Okay, so sensible physical systems should have time-like killing vector. That's quite a different thing. Of course, there can be non-sensible metrics which don't make physical sense, which don't have a time-like killing vector. That's also possible. Okay, so we have to be very careful about this. In general, though, geometry doesn't require existence of a killing vector. And actually, it's an instructive example. I'll try to include it in the next homework assignment, to take this kind of thing and work out all the killing vectors in these coordinates and then work them out also in other coordinates. And then you can also check that if you work them out in 2 sets of coordinates, what should be the relation? The dx by dx prime factor, which is there always when you transform a metric, when you transform a vector. So those kind of exercises are very useful. Good. Okay. So I think I'll stop here, and next time, the only thing I wanted to do before starting on Schwarzschild is to talk about the energy momentum tensor a little more. But maybe I'll start by, maybe we'll get to Schwarzschild next time itself, because it's high time to get that. Okay, so that is Thursday, 4 p.m.